The elegant ballroom of the Grand Magnolia in Charleston, South Carolina, was a vision of love and celebration on the evening of October 14th, 2023. Family and friends gathered to celebrate the wedding of 32-year-old Eric Foster and 29-year-old Lauren Hayes. But by the end of the night, the bride and the best man lay dead on the dance floor, and Eric stood motionless as guests screamed. This wasn't the result of a long-brewing feud or premeditated revenge. It was the breaking point of a man who stumbled upon the ultimate betrayal on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Let's rewind to the beginning of the day to understand how it all fell apart. The day started with the kind of energy every couple dreams about on their wedding day. The sun beamed down on the lush gardens of the Grand Magnolia, a perfect venue for Eric Foster and Lauren Hayes' long-anticipated wedding. The air smelled of blooming roses, and the hum of last-minute preparations added to the excitement of the day. Eric stood in his tailored navy blue suit, already beaming from the inside out. To him, this was the culmination of years of love, hard work, and commitment. Eric was proud of what he'd built, not just in his career as a software engineer but in his life with Lauren. She was everything he ever wanted: beautiful, kind, and fiercely independent. At 29, Lauren ran a trendy boutique in Dallas that had become a local favorite. Their love story was the kind that got them stopped at restaurants by strangers who'd say, "You two are perfect together." And then there was Ryan Blake, Eric's best man and his closest friend since high school. Ryan, 33, was the guy who knew every story from Eric's awkward teen years and always had his back. When Eric started dating Lauren 4 years ago, Ryan was her biggest cheerleader. "You've got to keep her, man," Ryan had said when he first met her. Today, Ryan was all smiles, cracking jokes with the groomsmen and keeping the energy light, just as Eric expected from his oldest friend. But not everything was as seamless as it appeared. The morning of Eric Foster and Lauren Hayes' wedding was nothing short of magical. The Grand Magnolia, a sprawling estate just outside Dallas, was alive with the sounds of bustling staff, chirping birds, and the laughter of excited guests. The day had been months in the making, planned down to the finest detail. Eric spent the morning getting ready with his groomsmen in the estate's library, a stately room filled with dark wood shelves and a crackling fireplace. His best man, Ryan Blake, kept the mood light with his usual quick wit, poking fun at Eric's nerves. Ryan had been Eric's closest friend for over 15 years. He was the guy Eric could count on for anything, the person who had stood by him through every tough moment and every triumph. Eric felt lucky to have Ryan there, not just as his best man but as a brother in every way that mattered. Ryan had helped Eric with nearly every detail of the wedding, from planning the bachelor party to ensuring the reception would run smoothly. Watching Ryan joke with the other groomsmen, Eric felt grateful. His life was falling perfectly into place. Upstairs, Lauren was preparing with her bridesmaids in the bridal suite. The room was full of the usual pre-wedding chaos. Makeup brushes scattered on the vanity, bridesmaids zipping up their dresses, and Lauren standing in front of a full-length mirror as her maid of honor adjusted her veil. Lauren looked stunning in her lace gown, and her bridesmaids showered her with compliments. But amid the laughter and excitement, there was a quiet moment of hesitation when a knock came at the door. It was Ryan, holding a small box. He smiled as he stepped into the room, saying that Eric had forgotten to give Lauren something that morning. Inside the box was a delicate bracelet, simple and elegant. Lauren smiled warmly as she put it on, thanking Ryan for bringing it. A few of the bridesmaids exchanged glances, but no one said anything. Ryan lingered for a moment longer than expected before leaving, his usual charm intact, but there was a strange tension in the air after he left. One of the bridesmaids, Amanda, Lauren's childhood friend, couldn't help but notice the way Lauren looked at Ryan as he walked out. It wasn't overtly suspicious, just enough to make Amanda wonder if there was something unspoken between them. As the morning went on, Lauren seemed distracted. She laughed and chatted with her bridesmaids, but there were moments when she fell quiet, staring out the window with an expression that was hard to read. Amanda didn't press her, figuring it was just pre-wedding nerves, but the memory of the brief exchange with Ryan lingered. Downstairs, Eric was preparing for the pre-ceremony photos. He adjusted his cufflinks for the 5th time, trying to calm the jitters that were starting to creep in. He wasn't nervous about marrying Lauren. He was certain about that, But the weight of the day, the attention from so many people, was starting to feel overwhelming. Ryan noticed and clapped him on the shoulder, telling him to relax. During the photos, Eric caught a glimpse of Ryan and Lauren talking near the edge of the garden. They were laughing about something, their heads close together. Eric felt a flicker of unease, but quickly dismissed it. Ryan had always been good at making people laugh, and Lauren probably needed the distraction. He pushed the thought out of his mind, determined not to let anything ruin the day. As the ceremony time approached, Amanda found herself unable to shake a nagging feeling. She pulled Eric aside during a quiet moment and hesitated before speaking. She told him that Ryan seemed awfully close to Lauren today. Eric laughed it off, saying Ryan was just being himself, always trying to help. Amanda tried to let it go, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach remained. Eric, on the other hand, was fully focused on the ceremony. When Lauren walked down the aisle, everything else disappeared. She was breathtaking, and Eric felt his heart swell as he watched her. This was the moment he had dreamed of. As they exchanged vows, Eric's nerves melted away. To everyone watching, the ceremony was flawless. The couple seemed deeply in love, and the guests couldn't stop gushing about how perfect they looked together. But beneath the surface, small cracks were forming, cracks that would soon shatter the illusion of perfection. The ceremony was picture-perfect, just as Eric and Lauren had planned. The golden afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawns of the Grand Magnolia in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the white chairs and floral arrangements. Friends and family sat in quiet awe as Lauren walked down the aisle, her lace gown flowing elegantly behind her. Eric couldn't take his eyes off her. In that moment, everything felt right. The officiant spoke about love, commitment, and trust, qualities Eric believed were the foundation of his relationship with Lauren. He held her hands as they exchanged vows, his voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside him. Lauren's voice, however, trembled slightly as she spoke. Eric attributed it to nerves, but the thought lingered as they kissed to the sound of applause. The guests erupted into cheers as Eric and Lauren walked hand in hand back down the aisle, their smiles radiant. Photographers snapped away, capturing the happy couple as they posed in front of the flower arch. For Eric, it felt like the beginning of the life he'd always dreamed of. The reception began shortly after, set in a grand ballroom filled with candles, flowers, and the soft hum of a live jazz band. Guests mingled, drinks flowed, and the dance floor quickly filled with laughter and movement. Eric and Lauren shared their first dance as husband and wife, the room falling silent as everyone watched. Eric spun Lauren gently, her laughter ringing out, and for a moment, his earlier worries seemed like nothing. As the evening unfolded, Eric began to notice small things that didn't sit right. Lauren had been excusing herself frequently, always returning with an apologetic smile. She claimed to be checking on last-minute details, ensuring the night went off without a hitch. Eric believed her at first. Lauren had always been a perfectionist, and this was her big day too. It wasn't until their second dance, during a brief moment when she rested her head on his shoulder, that Eric asked if everything was okay. She looked up at him with a soft smile and assured him it was. "I just want everything to be perfect," she said, and he kissed her forehead, feeling guilty for doubting her. Later, Eric found himself talking with guests near the bar while Lauren was away yet again. Ryan, ever the social butterfly, was nearby, holding court with a group of Eric's old college friends. Eric couldn't help but notice that Ryan's tie was slightly loosened, and his usually immaculate appearance seemed less polished than usual. It was unlike Ryan to look anything but perfect, especially at an event like this. Eric's sister Amanda walked over, her face tight with concern. She'd been keeping an eye on Lauren all evening, watching the way she disappeared for long stretches and the odd glances she exchanged with Ryan. She didn't want to say anything during the ceremony, but now, with Lauren absent again, she felt compelled to speak up. "Eric," she began, her voice low so the surrounding guests couldn't hear. "Something's off. I've been watching Lauren and Ryan tonight. I think you should keep an eye on them." Eric frowned, his stomach knotting. "Amanda, what are you talking about? Ryan's my best man, and Lauren's just making sure everything's perfect. Don't ruin this for me with some wild theory." "I'm not trying to ruin anything," Amanda said, her tone sharp. but I've seen the way they've been acting today. It's strange. Just trust me on this. Eric sighed, brushing her off. You're overthinking it. Stop worrying. Amanda opened her mouth to argue, but thought better of it. She knew Eric wouldn't listen. Not yet, at least. She walked away, shaking her head, leaving Eric to wrestle with the seed of doubt she'd planted. As the night continued, Eric tried to focus on his guests and the festivities, but Amanda's words lingered in the back of his mind. Lauren returned after another lengthy absence, her face flushed. She approached Eric with a bright smile, slipping her arm around his waist. Sorry, I had to check on the caterers. They were running low on appetizers, she explained quickly. Eric smiled back, choosing to let it go for the sake of the evening. Ryan joined them moments later, handing Eric a fresh drink. Man, this is some party, he said, his tone light and easy. You and Lauren really outdid yourselves. Thanks, Ryan, Eric replied, his voice carefully neutral. He felt a flicker of unease, but reminded himself that Ryan was his best friend. Throughout dinner, Eric noticed Lauren and Ryan exchanging glances across the table. They laughed at the same jokes, leaning slightly toward each other as if sharing a secret. Amanda caught Eric's eye from the other side of the room, her expression saying what she didn't need to say aloud. The final straw came during the toasts. Ryan stood, raising his glass to the couple. His speech started like any other, warm, funny, and full of fond memories. But as he spoke about Lauren, his words felt off. Lauren's got a way of making everyone feel special, Ryan said, his eyes lingering on her. Eric, you're a lucky man. She's one of a kind. Lauren blushed, glancing down at her plate, while the guests clapped and cheered. Eric forced a smile, but the knot in his stomach tightened. Something about the way Ryan spoke, his tone, the way his eyes never left Lauren, made Eric's skin crawl. Eric couldn't ignore the tension building inside him. Lauren was missing again, and Ryan had slipped away shortly after her. Eric excused himself from a conversation with a relative and headed toward the hallway that led to the restrooms and a few side rooms. As he passed a partially open door, he heard muffled voices, one of them unmistakably Lauren's. He froze, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. Ryan, we can't keep doing this, Lauren said, her voice low but firm. Relax, Ryan replied, his tone calm. No one's going to find out. Eric stepped back, his chest tight. He didn't push the door open. Instead, he turned and walked away, his mind spinning. When Lauren returned to the ballroom a few minutes later, she greeted Eric with her usual bright smile, as if nothing had happened. Ryan followed shortly after, slipping seamlessly back into the crowd. Eric's jaw tightened, but he kept quiet. Not here. Not now. The night wasn't over yet. But deep down, something inside him was already breaking. The reception began with a burst of energy as guests moved from the ceremony space to the beautifully decorated ballroom. Eric took a moment to admire the scene. The flickering candlelight on every table, the golden drapes framing the dance floor, and the chatter of friends and family laughing as they settled into their seats. This was everything he had imagined. Eric held Lauren's hand tightly as they entered the room to a thunderous round of applause. The band launched into a lively tune as the couple made their way to the center of the dance floor for their first dance. Lauren moved gracefully, her dress trailing behind her as Eric held her close. He felt the tension of the day begin to dissolve as they swayed to the music. Whatever had been bothering him earlier seemed small in the glow of this moment. When the song ended, Eric stepped up to the microphone to deliver his toast. Clearing his throat, he scanned the room, grateful for the faces of those he loved most. His voice was steady as he thanked his parents for their support, the bridal party for their hard work, and the guests for sharing in their joy. And finally, Eric said, turning toward Lauren with a soft smile, to my wife, the woman who makes every day brighter and who I'm so lucky to call mine. I love you, Lauren. The room erupted into cheers and clinking glasses, and Eric felt a wave of pride as he returned to his seat beside Lauren. She smiled and squeezed his hand, but her eyes flickered away briefly, her expression almost unreadable. The party came alive as the meal was served and the open bar began to work its magic. Guests took to the dance floor, and the sound of laughter filled the room. Eric felt himself relaxing into the celebration, soaking in the compliments and congratulations that came his way. But as the evening wore on, he couldn't help but notice Lauren slipping away from the table more often than seemed normal. The first time, she excused herself with a quick, "I'll be right back, just need to fix my makeup." Eric didn't think much of it, chatting with Ryan and a few other groomsmen while she was gone. She returned after about 10 minutes, her lipstick fresh and her demeanor as cheerful as ever. But then she disappeared again, this time saying she needed to check in with the wedding coordinator about the cake. Eric found it odd but shrugged it off, knowing how detail-oriented Lauren could be. When she came back, she was flustered, brushing a stray hair from her face and murmuring something about the cake being fine after all. By the third time, Eric's patience was wearing thin. He caught her sneaking out of the ballroom again, glancing over her shoulder as she went. His gut told him something was off, but he pushed the thought aside. He didn't want to ruin the mood by overthinking. As Eric sipped his drink and scanned the crowd, Amanda appeared at his side. Her expression was serious, a stark contrast to the festivities around them. "Hey," she said, her voice low enough not to draw attention. Eric turned to her, confused by the look on her face. "What's up?" Amanda hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "I don't want to stir the pot, but I've been watching Ryan and Lauren tonight." Eric's brow furrowed. "Okay. They've been close. Closer than they should be." Amanda glanced toward the dance floor, where Ryan was talking to a group of bridesmaids. "I'm not saying there's anything happening, but it feels weird." Eric let out a short laugh, trying to shake off the discomfort creeping into his chest. "Come on, Mandy. Ryan's like my brother, and Lauren's probably just stressed from the day. It's nothing." Amanda didn't look convinced but nodded, not wanting to push further. "I just thought you should know." Eric clapped her on the shoulder. "Appreciate it, but don't worry. Everything's fine." But as Amanda walked away, her words lingered. Later in the evening, Eric was making his rounds, thanking guests for coming, when he noticed Lauren and Ryan near the kitchen entrance. They were standing close, their heads bent together as they spoke in hushed tones. Something about the way Ryan's hand lightly touched Lauren's arm sent a chill through Eric. Without thinking, Eric made his way toward them, his footsteps quick and purposeful. As he approached, they immediately stopped talking and stepped apart. Lauren smiled nervously, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "Ryan was just giving me some advice about our honeymoon spots. He's been to Mexico, right, Ryan?" Ryan nodded, his usual grin plastered across his face. "Yep. Just telling her about some great places to check out in Cabo." Eric forced a tight smile, feeling a growing knot in his stomach. "Right. Well, everyone's wondering where the bride is. We should probably get back." "Of course," Lauren said quickly, brushing past Eric as she headed back to the ballroom. Ryan patted Eric on the shoulder as he followed Lauren. "Man, you really hit the jackpot with her. She's one of a kind." Eric didn't respond. He stood there for a moment, staring after them, a heavy sense of unease settling over him. Something wasn't adding up. When Eric returned to the ballroom, he found Lauren laughing with some guests as if nothing had happened. Ryan had slipped seamlessly into a conversation with a group of groomsmen, his carefree demeanor intact. To everyone else, the night was perfect, a joyous celebration of love. But for Eric, the cracks were starting to show. And though he didn't know it yet, those cracks were about to widen into a chasm that would change everything. The reception was in full swing, with the ballroom alive with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Eric did his best to mingle with the guests, thanking them for coming, shaking hands, and smiling for the dozens of photos being snapped. On the surface, he was every bit the happy groom, but his mind was elsewhere. There was a nagging feeling deep in his gut, one that had started earlier that day and had only grown stronger as the evening wore on. He couldn't quite pinpoint it, but something about Lauren's behavior had shifted. She floated through the room effortlessly, her smile bright and practiced, but Eric noticed little things. She'd excuse herself more often than usual, disappearing for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. When he'd ask where she'd been, she'd wave it off with, "Oh, just saying hi to people," or "needed a quick touch-up." It was convincing enough, But the excuses started piling up. Ryan, too, seemed unusually attentive. He was always nearby, always quick with a joke or a drink, and always keeping himself in Lauren's orbit. It wasn't anything overt. Ryan was good at keeping things subtle. Still, Eric couldn't ignore the lingering glances, the way Lauren laughed just a little too hard at his jokes, or the moments when Ryan would lean in close to whisper something to her. Each time Eric caught it, he told himself he was imagining things. It was his wedding day, after all. He had to focus on the good, not let his mind run wild. That fragile resolve began to crack when one of the groomsmen, Matt, stumbled over to him, clearly drunk. Matt clapped Eric on the back, grinning like a fool. "Man, you did good, buddy. Lauren's a knockout." "But hey," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "you sure you're the only one who thinks so?" Eric frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Matt shrugged, his words slurring a bit. "I mean, you've seen Ryan and Lauren, right? Always sneaking off, always whispering. Hell, I saw him fixing her dress strap earlier. Not saying anything, man, but just saying, you know?" Eric forced a laugh, trying to dismiss it. "Come on, Matt, don't start rumors. Ryan's my best friend. He's just making sure Lauren's okay. It's a big day for her." Matt grinned, clearly not taking the hint. "Yeah, sure. I get it. But still, you might want to keep an eye on them. Wouldn't be the first time the best man got a little too close to the bride." With that, he wandered off toward the bar, leaving Eric standing there, his stomach in knots. Eric's gaze immediately went to Lauren, who was across the room talking to a group of guests. She looked calm, carefree even, but Eric's focus shifted to Ryan, standing not far from her. Ryan was watching her intently, and when she glanced in his direction, they exchanged a quick smile. It wasn't long, but it was enough to make Eric's chest tighten. He told himself Matt was just drunk and being stupid, but the seed had already been planted. The small moments he'd been brushing off all day now seemed bigger, heavier. As the night wore on, Eric caught more moments that didn't sit right. At one point, he noticed Ryan and Lauren talking near the dance floor. Lauren was adjusting the hem of her dress, and Ryan leaned down to help. His hands lingered just a second too long, and the way Lauren looked at him, grateful but with something unspoken in her eyes, made Eric's blood run cold. Later, Lauren excused herself again, leaving her phone on their table. Eric stared at it for a long moment, torn. He'd never been the type to invade someone's privacy, but the unease gnawing at him had grown unbearable. He looked around. No one was paying attention to him. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached for the phone. His hands shook as he unlocked it. She'd given him her password months ago, back when trust between them had been implicit. Now, it felt like he was crossing a line he couldn't come back from. The first thing he opened was her messages. At the top of the list was a thread with Ryan. His heart pounded as he tapped on it, the screen filling with texts that made his stomach drop. "Can't stop thinking about last night. Just act normal. We'll talk later. Meet me near the kitchen in 10. Nobody will notice." Eric read the messages over and over, his breathing growing shallow. His chest tightened with a mix of rage, humiliation, and disbelief. The timestamps confirmed what he feared most. These weren't old messages from a time before him. They were from today. He scrolled further, finding more texts. There was nothing overly explicit, but the tone was unmistakable, flirty, intimate, the kind of connection that didn't belong between his best friend and his wife. Setting the phone back down, Eric felt his vision blur. His jaw clenched as his mind raced. Every lingering glance, every whispered conversation, every excuse Lauren had made that day, it all clicked into place. The messages weren't just damning. They were a confirmation of the betrayal he'd been too blind, or too trusting, to see. Lauren returned a few minutes later, her smile as bright as ever. She kissed Eric on the cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "Hey, babe, you okay?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yeah," Eric said, his voice tight. "Fine." She didn't seem to notice anything wrong as she moved on to chat with some friends. Eric stayed rooted to his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers, but he forced himself to stay calm. A scene at their wedding wouldn't solve anything. As the music played on and guests danced and laughed around him, Eric sat quietly, staring at the phone Lauren had left behind. The messages replayed in his mind, each one adding fuel to the fire building inside him. He glanced toward the dance floor, where Lauren and Ryan were now laughing together, their bodies close as they moved to the music. Eric's jaw tightened. The cracks that had started forming that morning had widened into a chasm, and there was no going back. But he wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. The night wasn't over, and Eric was determined to get through it before deciding what to do. For now, he'd watch, wait, and let the weight of their betrayal sink in. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before everything else came crashing down. The reception was winding down, and the lively buzz that had filled the ballroom earlier was softening into a more intimate hum. Some guests had already left, their goodbyes punctuated by hugs and congratulations. Others lingered, enjoying the last few dances, their laughter mingling with the gentle clinking of glasses. Eric stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching the evening wind down while his thoughts churned. He hadn't seen Lauren in a while. She'd slipped away again, claiming she needed to check on something with the staff. That knot in his stomach, the one that had been growing all day, was now an unbearable weight. Ryan was also nowhere to be found, which only deepened Eric's unease. He tried to shake it off, telling himself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but his instincts wouldn't let him rest. Something wasn't right. Eric excused himself from a conversation with one of his uncles and started walking through the venue. He moved quietly, avoiding attention as he made his way toward the back halls of the estate. These were the quieter parts of the venue, used by staff and tucked away from the main reception area. It was a place no guest would have reason to go, unless they were trying to stay out of sight. The further he walked, the more his heart pounded. He tried to convince himself he was being paranoid, that he'd find Lauren chatting with a caterer or Ryan helping a guest. But deep down, he already knew he wouldn't like what he found. As Eric approached one of the side rooms, he heard muffled voices. He stopped in his tracks, his body tense. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of Lauren's voice drifted out. "This was supposed to be the last time," she said, her tone low and strained. A man's voice replied, equally hushed but unmistakable. "I don't care. I love you." Eric's heart stopped. It was Ryan. He stood frozen in place, every muscle in his body locked as if the air itself had turned to stone. His mind raced, his thoughts colliding in a chaotic whirlwind. He wanted to believe he'd misheard, that his imagination was playing tricks on him, but the pain in his chest told him otherwise. Slowly, he leaned closer, peeking through the small gap in the door. Inside the dimly lit room, he saw them. Lauren was standing close to Ryan, her hands on his chest, her expression torn between frustration and something that made Eric's stomach churn: affection. Ryan held her wrists gently, his body angled toward hers in a way that left no doubt about their intimacy. Eric's breathing grew shallow, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to burst through the door, to demand an explanation, to scream at them for betraying him on what should have been the happiest day of his life. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the weight of what he was seeing. Lauren's voice broke the silence again. "We can't keep doing this. It's over. It has to be." Ryan shook his head, his voice firm. "I don't care what you say. I love you. I always have." The words hit Eric like a sledgehammer. He stumbled back a step, his mind spinning. The scene in front of him blurred as tears welled in his eyes. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But no matter how much he wanted to deny it, the truth was staring him in the face. Eric took another step back, careful not to make a sound. He couldn't bear to see or hear anymore. Quietly, he turned and walked away, his footsteps soft against the polished wooden floor. As he moved through the hall, his mind raced. Anger, humiliation, and heartbreak collided in a storm of emotions he couldn't control. His heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming quick and shallow as if the air itself was suffocating him. He replayed the last few minutes over and over, each time hoping it would make sense, that he could find some explanation that didn't involve betrayal. But there was none. Lauren had betrayed him. Ryan had betrayed him. The two people he trusted most had shattered everything he believed in. Eric reached the quiet garden outside the venue, needing air, needing space, needing to think. The cool night breeze brushed against his face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He thought about the past 4 years with Lauren, how he had loved her, supported her, planned their future together. He thought about Ryan, the friend who had been like a brother to him, the person he trusted implicitly. Every laugh, every shared memory, now felt like a cruel joke. How long had this been going on? How many times had Ryan and Lauren lied to his face, pretending to care about him while sneaking around behind his back? The thought made Eric's blood boil. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stared out at the darkness. A part of him wanted to go back inside, to confront them, to make them feel the pain he was feeling. But another part of him, the part still clinging to some shred of composure, told him to wait. He couldn't explode, not here, not now. Eric leaned against the cold stone wall of the garden, his mind spiraling. The sound of the reception carried faintly in the background. The laughter, the music, the celebration. It all felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. For the first time that day, Eric felt truly alone. He thought about Amanda, the warnings she'd given him earlier. She'd seen something he hadn't, or maybe something he didn't want to see. He hated himself for ignoring her, for dismissing the signs that now seemed so glaringly obvious. Eric stayed outside for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Slowly, the initial wave of shock began to give way to a cold, simmering anger. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but one thing was certain: the night wasn't over. Not for him, not for Lauren, and not for Ryan. Eric took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the fire in his chest only burned hotter. The reception had reached its peak, with the dance floor packed and laughter echoing through the grand hall. The night, to most of the guests, seemed like a perfect celebration of love. But for Eric, it was a nightmare he was barely holding together. His hands gripped the edge of his chair as he watched Lauren glide across the room, chatting and laughing like nothing was wrong. Ryan wasn't far from her, as usual, his charm on full display as he mingled effortlessly with the guests. Eric had spent the past hour trying to make sense of what he had seen and heard earlier. He couldn't get the image of them out of his mind. Lauren's hand on Ryan's shoulder, their hushed words, and the undeniable intimacy between them. His anger simmered beneath the surface, his humiliation tightening like a noose around his throat. But Eric was determined not to explode, at least not yet. When the band paused to take a break, Eric saw his opportunity. He walked to the DJ booth, trying to keep his voice steady as he asked for the microphone. The DJ hesitated for a moment, sensing something off in Eric's demeanor, but handed it over anyway. Eric stepped onto the small stage, his heart pounding. The chatter in the room died down as guests turned to look at him, their faces expectant and smiling. Eric's voice cracked slightly as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for being here tonight. This has been a day to remember, to say the least." He let out a short, humorless laugh, his grip on the mic tightening. The crowd clapped politely, unaware of the storm brewing. Lauren, standing near the bar, froze mid-conversation. She turned slowly to face him, her smile faltering. Ryan, who had been talking with a group of groomsmen, stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto Eric. Eric's voice grew steadier, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that cut through the room. "I also want to take a moment to thank two very special people in my life. My beautiful wife, Lauren, and my best man, Ryan." He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on them. "The two people I thought I could trust the most." A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. Guests exchanged confused glances, their smiles fading. Lauren's face drained of color, and Ryan's jaw clenched. Eric continued, his tone dripping with bitterness. "You know, they say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. And for a while, I believed that. But it turns out, I've been celebrating a lie." Gasps erupted from the guests, the air in the room thick with tension. Lauren took a step forward, her voice shaky as she called out, "Eric, what are you doing?" Eric ignored her, his gaze fixed on the crowd. While I've been up here, thanking everyone for sharing this special day with us, these two have been sneaking off together. Behind my back. For who knows how long. The room fell silent, the weight of Eric's words sinking in. Lauren's hands trembled as she held them up defensively. Eric, stop. This isn't the time. Ryan stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled. Eric, you don't understand. This isn't. Eric cut him off, his voice rising. Don't you dare try to explain. I saw you. I heard you. This was supposed to be the last time. Remember that, Ryan? Or should I say, I don't care, I love you? The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Lauren burst into tears, covering her face with her hands as the guests murmured in disbelief. Ryan's calm facade cracked, his expression a mix of anger and panic. Eric, you're making a scene, Ryan said, his voice sharp. Eric let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm making a scene? You two have been making a mockery of my entire life, and I'm the one making a scene. The murmurs grew louder, with guests leaning toward each other, trying to piece together what was happening. Some stared at Lauren and Ryan, their expressions a mix of shock and judgment. Others looked at Eric with pity. Lauren took a shaky step toward him, her voice pleading. Eric, please, let's talk about this privately. Don't do this here. Eric's eyes burned with fury as he looked at her. Privately? You want privacy now? After sneaking around with my best friend at our wedding? He gestured toward the guests. No, Lauren. Everyone here deserves to know exactly what kind of people you two really are. Ryan moved closer, his hands up as if to calm Eric down. Look, man, I know you're angry, but... Angry? Eric interrupted, his voice shaking with emotion. You betrayed me, Ryan. You, of all people. You were supposed to have my back. And Lauren... He turned to her, his voice breaking. I loved you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? Lauren sobbed openly now, unable to meet his gaze. The room was electric with tension, the once lively reception now an unbearable spectacle. Someone from the crowd shouted, Eric, maybe take a breather, man. But Eric ignored them, his focus solely on the two people who had shattered his world. Ryan tried again, his voice calmer but strained. Eric, I get it. You're hurt. But this isn't how we should handle this. Eric's eyes narrowed, his voice a low growl. You don't get to tell me how to handle anything. You're a liar and a coward, Ryan. And you're not my friend anymore. The DJ awkwardly turned the mic volume down, but Eric's voice carried through the stunned silence. You can have her, he spat, glaring at Ryan. You two deserve each other. Lauren crumpled into a nearby chair, her sobs racking her body. Ryan, his face flushed with anger and shame, stood frozen, unable to respond. Eric dropped the mic onto the stage with a loud thud, the sound echoing through the silent room. Without another word, he walked off the stage, leaving a crowd of stunned and murmuring guests in his wake. As Eric left the room, he could still hear Lauren crying and Ryan's voice trying to calm her down. The sound of their voices made his chest ache with a mix of fury and heartbreak. The betrayal had been laid bare for everyone to see, but Eric's anger was far from spent. The worst was still to come. The room was still reeling from Eric's explosive toast, the air thick with tension as guests whispered and exchanged uneasy glances. Ryan and Lauren were huddled near the edge of the dance floor, both pale and visibly shaken. Lauren clutched at Ryan's arm as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. Ryan, meanwhile, stood stiffly, his jaw clenched as he scanned the room, avoiding Eric's glare. Eric hadn't moved far from the stage. He stood at the center of the room, his shoulders heaving with each breath. The rage he'd barely contained all night was now boiling over, and every second he watched Ryan and Lauren together only fueled the fire. The betrayal wasn't just in their actions. It was in their attempts to act as though they hadn't just destroyed him in front of everyone he cared about. Ryan finally stepped forward, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. His voice was low and measured, but there was an edge of fear beneath the calm. Eric, listen to me. This isn't how it looks. Eric barked out a bitter laugh, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom. Not how it looks. Really, Ryan? You think I didn't see the two of you sneaking off all day? You think I didn't hear what you said in that back room? His voice rose with every word, trembling with fury. You love her? That's what you said, right? You love my wife? Ryan took a cautious step closer. I'm sorry, man. I never meant for it to happen like this. Let's just talk. We can work this out. Work this out. Eric's voice cracked, the raw emotion cutting through his words. You think there's anything to work out after what you've done? Lauren, still clutching Ryan's arm, finally found her voice. Eric, please. We didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. Her voice was small, shaking, as though she already knew there was no way to make this right. Eric's eyes snapped to Lauren, his expression twisted with anger and disbelief. It just happened? He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. You made vows to me, Lauren. Promises. And the whole time, you were lying, sneaking around with him. He jabbed a finger toward Ryan, his voice shaking. Was today supposed to be some kind of joke to you? Lauren started to cry again, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. No, Eric, it wasn't like that. I love you, I do. But what? Eric cut her off, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. But you love him too? Is that what you're gonna say? That you couldn't choose between us? Ryan moved to step between them, his posture protective. Eric, that's enough. You're upset, and I get it, but you need to calm down. Eric's gaze flicked to Ryan, and something in his expression shifted. Calm down, he repeated, his voice suddenly quieter, more dangerous. You're telling me to calm down? Eric's eyes scanned the room, landing on the cake table nearby. Without hesitation, he strode toward it, his movements sharp and deliberate. Guests began to murmur nervously, sensing that something wasn't right. Reaching the table, Eric grabbed something from it. Eric, stop! Lauren cried out, her voice trembling with panic. Ryan's hands shot up in a defensive gesture, his voice trying to stay calm but cracking slightly. Eric, let's talk. This isn't what you think. You don't have to do this. Eric didn't respond. His grip tightened, his whole body tense, and the betrayal that had simmered beneath the surface all day now erupted into full view. His gaze darted between Lauren and Ryan, his voice low and steady but brimming with fury. After everything I did for you, Eric said, his words directed at both of them, this is how you repay me? Sneaking around behind my back? On this day? Lauren's voice trembled, her face pale as she tried to shield Ryan. We can fix this, Eric. Please, just put it down. Let's talk. Eric's eyes burned as he glared at her, his voice rising with each word. Fix this? You think there's anything to fix after what you've done? You ruined everything, Lauren. Everything. Ryan stepped forward cautiously, his hands still raised in a calming gesture. Eric, listen. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't the way. Let's step outside and talk like adults, okay? Like adults? Eric's voice cracked with a bitter laugh. You've been sneaking around with my wife, and now you want to play the reasonable one? His grip tightened as he took a step closer. You don't get to lecture me about being reasonable, Ryan. The tension in the room was suffocating. Guests stood frozen, some whispering nervously, others reaching for their phones to call for help. A few brave souls inched toward Eric, trying to de-escalate, but no one dared get too close. Lauren's voice broke through the thick silence again, desperate and pleading. Eric, stop. This isn't you. Please. Eric's face twisted in pain and rage as he looked at her. You don't get to say my name like that. Not after what you've done. Then, in a flash, everything exploded. Eric shoved Lauren aside, stepping past her with a sudden burst of movement. Ryan's eyes widened as Eric advanced toward him. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Ryan staggered back, a shocked expression frozen on his face. He stumbled to the ground, clutching at himself as chaos broke loose in the room. Screams filled the ballroom, guests scattering in every direction. Lauren dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she reached out toward Ryan. Her sobs were loud and anguished, echoing above the pandemonium. Ryan. Oh my God, Ryan. Eric, standing over them, seemed paralyzed for a moment. His chest heaved as he looked down at the two people who had shattered his world. His face was a storm of emotions, rage, heartbreak, and disbelief swirling together. Lauren turned her tear-streaked face up to him, her voice trembling as she begged, "Please, Eric, stop this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't do this. We can make this right." Eric's gaze locked onto hers, his voice hollow but brimming with pain. "Make it right?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You think there's any fixing this, Lauren? You destroyed everything. You destroyed me." Before anyone could react, Eric moved toward her, his expression unreadable but determined. Lauren's screams rang out as she tried to crawl backward, her hands raised in a desperate attempt to stop him. The room erupted into a new wave of panic as guests screamed for someone to intervene. But it was too late. Lauren collapsed beside Ryan, her sobs fading into silence. The once vibrant ballroom, filled just moments ago with laughter and celebration, was now a scene of chaos. Guests cried out in disbelief, some running for the exits, others rooted in place as the weight of what had happened sank in. Eric stood frozen, the rage that had consumed him moments ago now replaced with a hollow stillness. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the chaos as someone shouted, "The police are here!" Eric slowly turned to face the officers, his expression drained of emotion. He didn't resist as they approached, allowing them to restrain him without a word. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of the entire night had finally crushed him. As the chaos of the room swirled around him, the cries of horrified guests, the confusion, the shouts, he spoke softly, almost to himself, his words lost beneath the noise. They deserved it. The officers led him away, his face unreadable as the chaos of the ballroom faded behind him. The once celebratory space was now a scene of horror, the untouched wedding cake sitting on its table, and the dance floor stained after the conflict. Eric didn't resist as they placed him in the back of the squad car. The distant sound of Lauren's bouquet being crushed underfoot was the only thing he heard before the doors slammed shut. The day that was supposed to mark the beginning of his future had instead become the moment his life came crashing down. After his arrest, Eric faced 2 serious charges, and the case quickly became the focus of intense public attention. Eric's defense centered on the emotional turmoil he experienced, claiming he acted in a moment of overwhelming distress. In the end, the jury found him guilty, acknowledging the circumstances surrounding his actions. Eric was sentenced to 20 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. The verdict left friends, family, and onlookers reflecting on how a day meant to celebrate love had spiraled into something unimaginable. For Eric, the sentence marked the beginning of a long reckoning with the choices made in the heat of heartbreak and anger.